The last time I died, it wasn't quiet. I remembered the weight of it, the crushing, suffocating weight of everything I'd helped her steal. Canned goods, bottled water, bags of rice and flour, thousands of pounds of supplies, all of it pressing down on my chest, my ribs cracking one by one, my lungs collapsing under the pressure. I remembered her face, twisted with rage and something that looked almost like relief. "It's your fault," she'd screamed. "You chose the beauty power. If you'd taken the space power, I wouldn't have been so miserable. They wouldn't have tied me up like an animal. They wouldn't have used me like a walking pantry." She'd been standing over me, watching me die, and she hadn't even flinched. "All of this," she gestured at the pile of supplies that was slowly crushing the life out of me. "All of this could have been yours. You were the one who could have been safe. You could have been the one who had everything. But you wanted to be pretty. You wanted them to look at you and want you. And now you're going to die under the weight of what you made me become." I tried to speak. I tried to tell her that I never wanted the beauty power, that she was the one who'd pushed me toward it, that she'd told me it was the smart choice, that she'd made me believe being wanted was the same as being safe. I tried to tell her that I'd spent my entire life being used by men who only wanted one thing, and that the beauty power had only made it worse. But I couldn't breathe. I couldn't speak. I could only watch her turn away, leaving me to die under the weight of a future I'd never wanted. And then, nothing. Darkness. Silence. The kind of silence that felt like it would never end. And then, suddenly, light. I opened my eyes. I was standing in the middle of a flea market, the late afternoon sun warm on my face. The air smelled like dust and fried food and the faint, metallic tang of old metal and cheap jewelry. The sounds of haggling vendors and chattering shoppers filled my ears, familiar and strange all at once. I blinked. My hands were young again. Smooth. Unscarred. No broken fingernails, no calluses from digging through frozen rubble, no frostbite scars on my knuckles. I was alive. I was whole. I was back. And standing right next to me, laughing at something on her phone, was Lily. My best friend. My murderer. The woman who had watched me die and walked away without a backward glance. "Can you believe this?" she said, not looking up from her phone. "This is the worst flea market I've ever been to. How did you even find this place? I told you we should have gone to the mall." I stared at her. I couldn't speak. I couldn't breathe. She looked up, finally noticing my expression. "What's wrong with you? You look like you've seen a ghost." I had seen a ghost. I'd seen my own death, and I'd just gotten a second chance. I swallowed hard and forced my voice to work. "Nothing. I'm fine. I felt dizzy for a second." "Probably because you haven't eaten anything all day." She rolled her eyes and went back to her phone. "Come on, let's get out of here. There's nothing good here anyway." There was something good. I knew there was. I remembered this day. I remembered the old man with the folding table at the back of the market. The one who'd had 2 black stones that looked like nothing special. The ones we'd bought for $10 each. The stones that had changed everything. "Wait," I said, grabbing her arm before she could walk away. "I want to check out that booth over there. The one with the old man." Lily followed my gaze. "That junk? Seriously? It's just a bunch of old rocks and broken jewelry. Let's go. Just give me 5 minutes." I didn't wait for her to argue. I walked toward the booth, my heart pounding in my chest. I remembered exactly where it was, the second row from the back, next to a booth selling vintage records. The old man had been sleeping in his chair, and we'd had to wake him up to buy the stones. But this time, I wasn't going to share them. I reached the booth and stopped. The old man was there, just as I remembered, dozing in his chair with a hat pulled down over his eyes. The stones were on the table, 2 small, black, unremarkable rocks that looked like they'd been pulled out of a riverbed and forgotten. They didn't look like anything special. They shouldn't have been special. But I knew what they were. I reached out and picked them up, cradling them in my palm. They were cool and smooth, the kind of stones you'd skip across a pond without a second thought. "What are those?" Lily appeared at my elbow, looking down at my hand with mild curiosity. Rocks. You dragged me over here for rocks. Something like that. I looked at the 2 stones. I remembered the first time, how Lily had grabbed the one that gave her the space power, and I'd been left with the one that made me beautiful. I remembered thinking it was fine, that I could live with it, that beauty was its own kind of power. I remembered being wrong. And I remembered the moment I'd told myself, if I ever got a second chance, I wouldn't let her take everything again. I bit my finger. Hard. The blood welled up, dark red against my pale skin. I heard Lily's sharp intake of breath. Lily, I said, my voice steady, you're going to be so mad at me. Before she could respond, I pressed my bleeding finger to the first stone. The world went white. I felt something crack open inside my mind, a space that hadn't been there before, a vast, endless expanse of emptiness that stretched in all directions. It was huge. It was infinite. It was everything I needed. And then I pressed my finger to the second stone. The same sensation, the same expansion, the same feeling of something new opening up inside me. Then I watched both stones crumble to dust in my palm. Lily was frozen. Her face had gone pale, her mouth hanging open, her eyes wide with disbelief. What? Her voice cracked. Cora, what did you do? Rocks, I said, brushing the dust from my hands. Just rocks. Those weren't rocks. You did something. What did you do? I looked at her, and for a moment, I felt almost sorry for her. She'd been so close to winning. She'd had everything, the power, the supplies, the future. And she'd thrown it all away because she couldn't stand to see me happy. Lily, I said quietly, did you really think you were the only one who got a second chance? She stared at me. I could see the moment realization dawned, the moment she understood exactly what I'd done. You're dead, I said. The old you. The one who killed me. She's gone. And I'm not going to let her come back. The flea market faded behind me as I walked away, but I didn't look back. I didn't need to. I knew what I'd left behind, Lily standing frozen in front of that empty booth, her face a mask of shock and rage, her hands still reaching for something that no longer existed. I knew she'd eventually find her way home, maybe even try to plot a way to get revenge, to steal back what she thought was hers. She'd fail. I'd make sure of it. But that was a problem for later. Right now, I had 3 days. 3 days before the world ended. 3 days to build a mountain of supplies large enough to keep my parents and me alive through months of frozen hell. And I had a space big enough to hold it all. The first thing I did was call a car service. I didn't have time to mess around with buses or waiting for rides. I needed to move fast, and I needed to move now. 30 minutes later, I was standing in front of a U-Haul rental lot, staring at a fleet of box trucks. The largest one they had was a 26-foot beast, big enough to hold the contents of a small apartment. It was overkill for a normal shopping trip. This wasn't a normal shopping trip. Just for the day? The rental clerk asked, looking at my license with mild curiosity. Maybe longer, I said. I'll keep you posted. I paid in cash, signed the paperwork, and drove the truck straight to the nearest Costco. The Costco was packed, but not in the way it would be in 3 days, when everyone finally understood what was coming. Right now, people were still going about their normal lives, buying normal things, complaining about normal problems. I was the only one in the store who knew what was about to happen. I grabbed a flatbed cart and started loading it like a woman possessed. Water, cases and cases of bottled water, dozens of gallons, enough to keep a family of 3 alive for months. Canned goods, vegetables, fruit, soups, chili, stews, everything that could be opened and eaten without cooking. Rice, beans, pasta, flour, sugar, all the dry staples that would keep forever if stored properly. I moved through the aisles like a hurricane, grabbing everything in sight. Canned meat, canned fish, peanut butter, jelly, granola bars, protein powder, vitamins. I grabbed boxes of instant coffee and tea bags, containers of powdered milk, bottles of honey and maple syrup. I grabbed everything I could remember needing from my first life. Everything I'd wished I'd had when I was trapped in that frozen hell, scraping for scraps, trading pieces of myself just to survive another day. The checkout line was long, but I didn't care. I loaded my haul onto the belt and watched the total climb higher and higher. $800. $1,200. $1,800. When it was finally over, I'd spent nearly $2,000 in a single trip. The cashier gave me a strange look as I swiped my card, but she didn't ask questions. Maybe she thought I was stocking up for a big party. Maybe she thought I was crazy. I didn't care what she thought. I rolled the cart out to the truck and started loading. The space was waiting for me, vast and empty, ready to swallow everything I could throw at it. But I couldn't load directly into the space where people could see. Too many cameras. Too many witnesses. I had to be smart. I loaded the boxes into the truck, closed the door, and drove to an empty parking lot a few blocks away. No cameras. No people. Just me and my secret. I closed my eyes, focused on the truck's cargo area, and thought, take it. The boxes vanished. Every single one of them. Gone from the truck and safely stored in my space. I smiled. It was working. Then I drove back to Costco for another round. I spent the rest of the day bouncing between stores. Costco, Sam's Club, every wholesale club within a 30-mile radius. I bought meat, beef, chicken, pork, fish, hundreds of pounds of it, all vacuum-sealed and ready to freeze. I bought dairy, blocks of cheese, containers of butter, cartons of eggs, everything that would keep for at least a few weeks. I bought fresh vegetables and fruit, knowing they wouldn't last forever but hoping to enjoy them while I could. I bought medicine. Painkillers, antibiotics, antihistamines, antacids, cough syrup and cold medicine, bandages and gauze and antiseptic. Everything I could think of that we might need if the world ended and the pharmacies closed forever. I bought clothes. Thermal underwear, heavy coats, waterproof boots, wool socks and thick gloves and knitted hats. Everything we'd need to survive when the temperature dropped below zero and the wind cut through you like a knife. I bought tools. A chainsaw. A generator. Extra gas cans. A portable stove. A water purification system. A first aid kit big enough to treat a small army. I bought a crossbow and bolts, a hunting knife and a machete. Things I'd never imagined owning in my old life, things I'd never thought I'd need. But I knew better now. I'd learned that the world was a cruel place, and that the only way to survive was to be ready for the worst. I filled the truck, emptied it into my space, and filled it again. Over and over and over, until I'd lost count of how many trips I'd made. By the time the sun went down, my space was starting to look like the warehouse of a very prepared prepper. Stacks of water bottles, pallets of canned food, rows of neatly organized supplies. It wasn't enough. It would never be enough. But it was a start. I pulled out my phone and called my parents. The phone rang twice before my mother picked up. Cora, is everything okay? You usually text. Mom, I need you to listen to me very carefully. There was a pause. My mother could hear the urgency in my voice, the fear I was trying so hard to hide. What's wrong? What happened? Nothing yet. But something is going to happen. Something big. I took a breath, steadying myself. Mom, in 3 days, the world is going to end. Not the whole world, I mean, the world as we know it. A freeze is coming. An extreme freeze. Temperatures so low that everything will stop working. The power grid, the water supply, the gas stations. Everything. Silence on the other end. Mom, are you there? I'm here. Her voice was careful, measured, the voice of a woman who was trying very hard not to panic. Cora, how do you know this? Because I've already lived through it. I told her everything. The other life, the death, the rebirth. The stones, the powers, the betrayal. The freeze that was coming and the months of chaos that would follow. I told her about Lily and what she'd done. I told her about the men who'd used us, the leaders who'd claimed to be heroes but were really just predators. I told her about everything I'd seen, everything I'd survived, everything I'd failed to do. And then I told her what I needed from her. Mom, I need you and Dad to trust me. I need you to sell the house, take all the money, and find a place that will keep us safe. A bunker, a basement, a cellar, anything that can hold 3 people and enough supplies to get us through the winter. I need you to do this without asking too many questions. And I need you to do it fast. We have 3 days. Maybe less. My mother was silent for a long moment. I could hear her breathing, could almost hear her thinking, trying to process everything I'd just told her. Then she said, "I'll talk to your father." Mom. I believe you, Cora. I don't understand it, but I believe you. We'll make it work. Relief washed over me like a wave. Thank you, Mom. Don't thank me yet. We haven't done anything. She was right. There was still so much to do. I hung up and sat in the dark for a moment, catching my breath. I was exhausted, running on adrenaline and fear. But I couldn't stop. Not yet. Not until I'd done everything I could to protect the people I loved. I started the truck and drove to the next store. I found my parents at the hotel lobby just before midnight. They were sitting in the corner, my father scrolling through his phone, my mother staring out the window at the dark street. They both looked up when I walked in, and for a moment, neither of them recognized me. The beauty power had done its work. I'd caught a glimpse of myself in a store window earlier and barely recognized my own reflection. My skin was clearer, my features sharper, my eyes brighter. I looked like I'd been airbrushed by a professional photographer. I wasn't sure how I felt about it. In my first life, I'd been beautiful too, the kind of beautiful that made people stare and men offer to buy you drinks. It had been a curse as much as a gift. I'd learned that being beautiful meant being seen as an object, a prize, something to be won and claimed. But I didn't have time to worry about that now. Mom. Dad. I walked toward them, and my mother's eyes widened in surprise. Cora. Is that really you? It's me. I know I look different. I can explain later. I sat down across from them, my hands trembling with exhaustion. Did you get everything done? My father nodded. We found a place. It's not much, a Cold War-era bunker about 30 miles outside the city. It's been abandoned for decades, but the structure is sound. I hired a crew to start reinforcing it tonight. How much did it cost? Most of what we had. He didn't look upset about it. But the house sold faster than we expected. We got a good price. Enough to cover the bunker and still have some left over. I felt tears prick at my eyes. Thank you. Both of you. I know this is crazy. I know it's hard to believe. Sweetheart. My mother reached across the table and took my hand. You're our daughter. We trust you. If you say something terrible is coming, we believe you. I squeezed her hand and tried not to cry. The next morning, I woke up in my hotel room with a strange sense of peace. It was the first time I'd slept without nightmares in months, maybe years. The weight of my past life, the trauma and the fear, had finally started to lift. I still had so much to do, so many supplies to gather, so many plans to make. But for the first time in a long time, I felt like I had a chance. I showered, dressed, and met my parents in the lobby. We grabbed a quick breakfast at a diner across the street. Real food, fresh eggs and bacon and coffee that actually tasted like something, and then I drove them to the bunker. The bunker was at the end of a long dirt road, hidden by trees and overgrown brush. It looked like nothing from the outside, just a small concrete structure, the kind you drive past without a second thought. But inside, it was something else entirely. 3 rooms, 1 large, 2 small, connected by a narrow corridor. Reinforced walls, a steel door, ventilation shafts, and a backup generator. It was small, cramped, and smelled like dust and decay. But it was ours. Perfect, I said, walking through the rooms and imagining what they would become. This is perfect. My father gave me a strange look. It's a hole in the ground. It's a hole in the ground that's going to save our lives. I spent the next few hours showing them my space. I pulled out supplies, cases of water, pallets of canned goods, bags of rice and beans. I demonstrated the power, making things appear and disappear at will. I told them about the first life, the freeze, The months of desperation that had nearly killed me. By the time I was done, my mother was crying. My father looked like he'd aged 10 years. "I'm sorry," I said, feeling guilty for bringing them into this. "I know it's a lot." "It's not your fault," my mother said. "You didn't ask for any of this." "But I could have." "Don't." She took my face in her hands and looked me in the eyes. "Don't you dare blame yourself for surviving. You did what you had to do, and you're doing it again. We're going to be fine. We're going to be together. That's all that matters." I hugged her and let myself cry. The next 2 days were a blur of activity. While my parents stayed at the bunker, supervising the work and making sure everything was ready, I kept shopping. I hit the pharmacies next, buying everything I could think of: antibiotics, painkillers, antacids, bandages, antiseptics. I bought cold medicine and allergy pills, vitamins and supplements, and enough over-the-counter pain relief to stock a small hospital. The pharmacists looked at me strangely, but they didn't ask questions. I spent my afternoon at the gas stations, filling every gas can I could find. The limit was 15 gallons per customer, but I went from station to station, buying as much as I could. I ended up with over 200 gallons, carefully stored in my space. Then I hit the hardware store. I bought a generator, extra fuel, a chainsaw, and enough firewood to last a season. I bought shovels and axes and rope. I bought nails and screws and duct tape. I bought a massive first aid kit and a set of walkie-talkies. I bought extra batteries, solar chargers, and a portable stove. The last stop was a feed store, where I bought chickens. 3 chickens and 2 rabbits, enough to start a small farm if we could keep them alive. They were expensive and noisy and didn't seem to like me, but I didn't care. Fresh eggs and meat were going to be worth more than gold in the coming months. On the 3rd day, I went to the gun store. It was the hardest part of the preparation. I'd never held a gun before, not in my old life, and not in the one I'd just lived. But I'd seen what happened to unarmed people in the freeze. I'd seen how quickly the strong preyed on the weak. I wasn't going to be prey this time. The store owner looked at me strangely as I walked in, but he didn't say anything. He just pointed me to the display cases and let me browse. I ended up buying a handgun, a rifle, and enough ammunition to make a small army nervous. I also bought a crossbow and a quiver of bolts, something quieter and less conspicuous. "This is a lot of firepower," the owner said as he rung up my purchase. "You expecting trouble?" "Always," I said. "Better safe than sorry." He nodded like he understood. I met my parents back at the bunker that night. The work was done. The bunker had been reinforced, the walls sealed, the doors replaced with thick steel panels. The generator was running, the supplies were stowed, and the beds were made. It wasn't home. It would never be home. But it was safe. We sat around a small table in the main room, eating canned soup and crackers, trying to pretend it was just another family dinner. "When do you think it will start?" my mother asked. "Soon," I said. "Tonight. Probably. Tomorrow at the latest." "How do you know?" "Because I've seen it before." I didn't tell them the details. There was no point. They didn't need to know about the fires and the floods and the chaos, the hunger and the cold and the fear. They just needed to know that we were going to survive. They just needed to know that I was going to keep them safe. I took the first watch that night. It was still warm outside, the kind of warm that made you think spring was here to stay. But I knew better. I knew it was the calm before the storm. I sat by the door, listening to the quiet hum of the generator, waiting for the world to end. It didn't take long. I fell asleep at dawn. The warmth of the previous night had vanished completely, replaced by a biting cold that seeped through the bunker's thick walls. I'd been up for hours, checking the perimeter, making sure the vents were clear, listening to the wind pick up and the first flakes of snow begin to fall. I didn't remember closing my eyes. One moment I was watching the weather forecast on my phone, the emergency alerts flashing across the screen, the frantic messages from people who just realized something terrible was happening, and the next moment, I was waking up to my mother's voice. "Cora! Cora, wake up!" I blinked, groggy and disoriented. "What happened?" "Look." She pointed at the small window near the top of the door. Look outside. I stumbled to my feet and peered through the thick glass. My breath caught in my throat. It was white. Everything was white. Snow, everywhere, piled high against the door, covering the ground, burying the trees. I couldn't see the road, couldn't see the fence, couldn't see anything beyond a few feet of swirling white. How long was I asleep? A few hours. My mother's voice was tight with fear. Your father's been trying to get a signal on the radio. Nothing. No news, no warnings, no emergency broadcasts. It's like the whole world went quiet. I turned away from the window. It's not quiet out there. It's just starting. The first day in the bunker was a blur of small tasks. My father finished setting up the generator, running the cables and checking the fuel levels. My mother organized the supplies, making sure everything was accessible and accounted for. I went through the space, cataloging what we had and what we'd need in the coming weeks. The temperature outside was already below freezing. By the end of the day, it would hit 0. By tomorrow, it would be well below that. We need to conserve energy, my father said, studying the fuel gauge on the generator. This thing won't run forever. We need to be smart about how we use it. Turn it off at night, my mother suggested. We can use the wood stove for heat. Save the generator for when we really need it. It's going to get cold, I warned. Really cold. We'll manage. My mother's voice was firm, determined. We're survivors. We always have been. The next few days were quiet. The snow kept falling, piling higher and higher against the bunker walls. The temperature dropped to -40, then -50, then -60. The wind howled constantly, a sound that seemed to come from everywhere at once, rattling the door and shaking the walls. Inside, we stayed warm. We cooked on the wood stove, heated water for washing, and huddled together at night under layers of blankets. It was cramped and uncomfortable and utterly miserable, but it was safe. On the 4th day, I heard something new. Voices. I was standing near the door, listening to the wind, when I heard it, low, muffled sounds coming from outside. I motioned for my parents to be quiet and pressed my ear against the cold metal. They know something. They must have known something, a man's voice said. Look at this place. Reinforced walls, steel door, ventilation system. That's not a random bunker. That's a prepared shelter. Who cares how they knew? Another voice replied. The question is whether they're still inside. I saw a woman here a few days ago. Old, maybe 60. She was talking about a daughter who was coming to stay. That means at least 3 people. Maybe more. But they're just civilians, they won't be able to stop us. I pulled back from the door, my heart pounding. I recognized that voice. It was Rex, one of the construction workers my father had hired. He'd known about the bunker. He must have told others, spread the word, brought a group back with him. Dad, I whispered. There are people outside. They want to get in. Who? That crew you hired. The construction workers. My father's face went pale. They know about the bunker. I don't think they know about the space. But they know we have supplies. We listened as the voices grew louder. More people joining the group, men, women, even the sound of children. They were planning something. They were getting ready to break in. We have to go, my mother said. We have to leave before they. There's nowhere to go. My father's voice was grim. It's -60 outside. We'd freeze before we reached the road. Then we stay and fight. And do what? There are at least a dozen of them. We don't have the weapons or the numbers. I stood in the middle of the room, my mind racing. I had the weapons. I'd stocked the space with enough firepower to hold off a small army. But I didn't want to use them. Not if I didn't have to. Wait, I said. Let me handle this. My parents both started to protest, but I held up my hand. Trust me. I walked to the door and unlocked it. I opened it just wide enough to slip through, then closed it behind me. The cold hit me like a physical blow. It was overwhelming, stealing my breath and freezing the tears in my eyes before they could fall. I pulled my coat tight and faced the group that was gathered just a few feet away. The man named Rex recognized me first. He grinned, revealing a row of yellowed, broken teeth. Well, look what we have here. I didn't expect. Stop, I said. Just stop right there. I didn't give him time to finish his sentence. I focused on the space, on the vast emptiness that lay waiting inside me, and I reached out with my mind. The first man to touch the door vanished. One moment he was there, his hand raised to strike the metal, and the next, he was gone. The others froze. They stared at the empty space where their friend had been, their faces a mixture of confusion and dawning horror. What did you do? Rex demanded. Where is he? I didn't answer. I reached out again, and another man vanished. Then another. Then another. One after another, they disappeared into the space, their bodies stored like so much debris. The ones who were left screamed and ran. But they didn't make it far. The snow was too deep, the cold too intense. They stumbled and fell, and I finished them before they could get back on their feet. When it was over, I stood in the middle of the frozen clearing, breathing hard. My parents had come to the door, watching with wide eyes. Cora. My mother's voice was barely a whisper. What did you do? I opened my mouth to answer, but no words came. I didn't know how to explain it. I didn't know how to explain any of it. I'd just killed 12 people. I'd done it without lifting a finger, without breaking a sweat, without feeling anything more than a distant sense of satisfaction. They'd been trying to hurt us. They'd been trying to take everything we had. And I'd stopped them. That was all that mattered. The weeks that followed settled into a strange, quiet rhythm. We woke at dawn, ate breakfast by the wood stove, and spent the mornings tending to our small indoor farm. My mother had planted seeds in the trays we'd set up under grow lights: lettuce, spinach, herbs, tomatoes. They grew slowly in the dim light, but they grew, and that was enough. The rabbits had already produced a litter of 6, and the chickens were laying eggs almost every day. My father kept the generator running, rationing the fuel carefully, and spent hours listening to the radio for any sign of life outside. There wasn't much. A few scattered broadcasts from emergency centers in the cities, warning people to stay indoors. A handful of desperate voices begging for help. Then silence. I spent my time organizing the supplies, checking the space, and watching the snow pile higher against the windows. It was boring, tedious work, but it kept me busy. And it kept me from thinking about Lily. The first sign that she was still alive came through a crackling radio broadcast. It was late at night, and I was on watch, sitting by the door with a cup of tea and a wool blanket wrapped around my shoulders. The radio was tuned to a frequency that had been active earlier in the week, and I'd left it on in case anyone broadcast a message. I almost missed it. A voice, familiar and yet strange, cutting through the static. Hello. Is anyone out there? My name is Lily. I'm a survivor. I know what's coming. I can help you. I sat up straight, my tea forgotten. It was her. The same voice that had laughed at me, mocked me, watched me die. The same voice that had tried to take everything from me. Hello, she repeated. If you can hear me, please respond. I have supplies. I have food. I can help you survive. I stared at the radio, my hands trembling with rage. She was still out there. Still scheming, still trying to build her power base, still trying to convince people she was someone worth following. My father appeared in the doorway, his face pale. Was that Lily? I said. Yes. What's she doing? Trying to build an army. I reached for the radio's microphone, then stopped myself. There was no point in confronting her. She'd just deny everything or twist my words into something they weren't. The only way to win against her was to ignore her, to let her schemes fall apart on their own. Don't worry, I said, turning off the radio. She's not going to be a problem. She doesn't have any real power. She's just pretending. But I wasn't sure I believed that. Lily's broadcasts continued over the next few weeks. She'd found a group of survivors, and she was using them to build her legend. She told them she had seen the future, that she'd known the freeze was coming, that she was the only one who could lead them through the darkness. She promised them safety, food, a new world, a better world. It was the same performance she'd given in the first life. The same lies, the same manipulation, the same hunger for power. But this time, it wouldn't work. Because this time, I had already taken what she needed to make it real. The first attack came a few weeks later. It was small, just a handful of desperate survivors, led by a man who'd heard that someone was living in the bunker, someone who had food and supplies. They wanted to take it from us. I took care of them the same way I'd taken care of the others. I stepped outside, let them see me, let them think I was weak and alone. And then I reached out with my mind. The space swallowed them whole. When it was over, I stood in the freezing cold and watched their bodies vanish into the void. My mother was at the door, her face pale but determined. "Are you okay?" she asked. "I'm fine." I wasn't sure I was telling the truth. But I wasn't sure it mattered. The attacks became more frequent after that. Word had spread about the bunker, about the supplies, about the woman who could make people disappear. It was a dangerous reputation. It drew the desperate, the violent, the hungry. They came in greater numbers, each wave more determined than the last. But I was always ready. I used the space to trap them, overwhelm them, defeat them. I didn't want to kill anyone. I'd never wanted to kill anyone. But I couldn't let them hurt my parents. I couldn't let them take what we'd built. So I did what I had to do. And every time I did, I felt another piece of myself break away. The freeze ended abruptly, for months later. One day, it was -40, the snow piling higher than the trees. The next, the temperature had risen to 30 above, and the snow was melting faster than any of us could have predicted. The melt was a disaster. The snow turned to water, and the water had nowhere to go. Roads flooded. Basements flooded. Entire towns were swallowed by the rising waters. The survivors who'd made it through the freeze now had to face a new threat. We were lucky. The bunker was built on high ground, and the floodwaters never reached us. But we watched the news, what little there was of it, and saw the devastation spreading. "We need to help," my mother said. "We can't just sit here and watch." "I know." I looked at the space, at the supplies we'd hoarded. We had more than enough. We could spare some for the people who needed it. "Let's go," I said. The journey to the nearest town took 3 days. The roads were treacherous, the bridges destroyed, the floodwaters still high. But we made it. We found the survivors huddled in the ruins of a church, too weak and too cold to keep fighting. We gave them food, water, medicine. We used the space to move supplies quickly, to bring them what they needed before they could ask for it. They looked at us with awe and gratitude. Some of them even started to kneel. "Don't," I said. "We're just people. Same as you." They didn't believe me. But they accepted our help. And that was enough. The flood ended after a month. The waters receded, leaving behind wreckage and mud and the slow, painful work of rebuilding. The government had started to reassert control, establishing camps and organizing relief efforts. They were doing the best they could with the limited resources they had. I watched it all from a distance, helping where I could, staying out of the spotlight. I wasn't the hero of this story. I was just a survivor, trying to make the best of a terrible situation. But I'd done something good. I'd saved lives. I'd made a difference. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like I'd finally found something worth holding on to. On the last day of the flood, I took a walk by myself. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink. The floodwaters had receded, leaving behind a muddy landscape that was slowly coming back to life. I could hear birds in the distance and frogs singing in the marsh. I thought about Lily. I didn't know where she was, or if she'd survived. I didn't know if she'd ever come back to haunt me, to try to take what I'd built. But I knew one thing for sure, I was finally free. I walked back to the camp where my parents were waiting and sat down beside them. "We're going to be okay," I said. "All of us. I know we will." My mother took my hand and squeezed it. "Yes," she said. "We will." And I believed her. A year passed. Not the kind of year you counted in calendars and holidays, the kind you counted in small victories. Days when the power stayed on longer than the day before. Nights when you could sleep without waking to the sound of someone breaking in. The slow, steady return of a world that had nearly ended. The government had done what governments do. They'd organized, distributed, and rebuilt. The camps had become communities, the communities had become towns, and the towns had started to look like something worth living in again. But it wasn't the old world. It would never be the old world. And for some people, that was a problem. I first heard that Lily was alive from a stranger. I was at the market, a sprawling affair of tents and tables where survivors traded what they had for what they needed. I'd come to sell some of the supplies I'd hoarded, to trade them for things we couldn't grow or make ourselves. Did you hear about the woman in the north? The merchant asked, handing me a bag of dried beans in exchange for a can of coffee. She's got a whole compound up there. Takes in refugees, gives them food and shelter. People are starting to call her the Queen of the North. I froze. What's her name? Lily something. She's got a following, that one. Says she knew the freeze was coming before anyone else. Says she was chosen by something, a god, maybe. I don't know. People believe what they want to believe. I thanked him and walked away, my hands shaking. She was still out there. Still alive, still scheming, still building her little empire. And now she had a reputation. I didn't tell my parents right away. I didn't want to worry them, didn't want to drag them back into a fight that should have been over. But I knew I couldn't ignore it. Lily had tried to kill me twice. She'd destroyed my life, stolen my future, laughed as I died. If she was building an army, she was doing it for one reason. She was coming for me. I started making plans. Quietly, carefully. I didn't know what she had, didn't know what she was capable of in this new world. But I knew one thing for sure, I wasn't going to let her win again. The confrontation came 3 months later. She found me at the market, of all places, the same market where I'd first learned she was alive. She walked up to me like she owned the place, flanked by 2 men who looked like they'd been hired to intimidate. Cora. She smiled, a cold, sharp smile that didn't reach her eyes. It's been a long time. Not long enough. Still bitter. That's a shame. I thought you'd have moved on by now. Move on. I laughed. You tried to kill me. You watched me die and walked away. That's not the kind of thing you move on from. She shrugged, as if my anger meant nothing to her. You took everything from me. The stones, the power, the future. I was just evening the score. You don't even believe that. Believe what? That you're a victim. You made your choices. You chose to be cruel, to be selfish, to hurt everyone who got in your way. And now you're building an army because you're still not willing to accept the consequences. Her smile faltered. You don't know anything about me. I know everything about you. I know that you're scared. I know that you're desperate. And I know that you're going to lose. She stepped closer, her voice dropping to a whisper. I'm not going to lose, Cora. I have followers now. People who believe in me. People who would die for me. People who don't know you. They know enough. I looked at her, really looked at her, and for the first time, I saw her for what she was. Not a villain, not a monster. Just a scared, lonely woman who'd convinced herself that the only way to survive was to take everything she could. Lily, I said quietly, it doesn't have to be like this. You could stop. You could walk away. You could try to be better. She stared at me for a long moment. Then she laughed. Be better. She shook her head. You really are naive. There's no better in this world. There's only the strong and the weak. And I'm not going to be weak anymore. She turned and walked away. The attack came the next night. I'd been expecting it, had prepared for it, had made sure my parents were safe and secure before I went to meet her. But nothing could have prepared me for the sheer size of the force she'd gathered. Dozens of people. Armed to the teeth, desperate and hungry and full of rage. They came at me from all sides, shouting and screaming, trying to overwhelm me with their numbers. I took them one by one. The space was my weapon, my shield, my salvation. I reached out and pulled them in, swallowed them whole, left nothing behind but empty air. Lily watched from a distance, her face pale. When it was over, I walked toward her. The men she'd brought were all gone, scattered into the void, never to be seen again. Lily, I said. It's over. She didn't try to run. She just stood there, her hands shaking, her eyes wide with fear. Please, she said. Please don't. I reached out and touched her shoulder. And I didn't pull her in. I was so close. I could have done it. I could have ended it forever. But I didn't. Instead, I let her go. Go, I said. Get out of here. And if I ever see you again, I won't be so merciful. She stared at me for a long moment. Then she turned and ran. I watched her disappear into the darkness and felt nothing. Not relief, not satisfaction, not even regret. Just a quiet, peaceful acceptance. I'd won. And I didn't need to destroy her to prove it. I went home that night and sat with my parents, eating dinner, talking about nothing important. It was a small thing, a simple thing. But it was everything. Cora, my mother said. Are you okay? I am, I said. I really am. Life went on after that. The government continued to rebuild. The cities started to come back to life. People started to hope again. I never saw Lily again. I heard rumors, sometimes, that she'd gone south, that she'd started a new life, that she'd finally found peace. I didn't know if they were true. I didn't care. What mattered was that I had my family. I had my home. I had a future that was my own. And for the first time in my life, I knew what it meant to be free. The winter of 2025 came and went like any other. The temperatures were still cold, the snow still deep. But it was nothing like the freeze, nothing like the nightmare we'd survived. And when spring came, we were ready. The garden bloomed. The chickens laid eggs. My mother laughed at something my father said, and I watched them from the doorway, a quiet smile on my face. We were going to be okay. All of us. I closed the door and went inside. Extra one. The girl who couldn't let go. She didn't sleep that night. Lily sat in the hollow shell of an abandoned gas station, her back against a shattered window, her knees pulled to her chest. The cold had seeped into her bones hours ago, but she barely noticed. All she could feel was the burning shame, the hollow ache of everything she'd lost. She'd gathered an army. She'd convinced people to follow her, to believe in her, to die for her. And Cora had made them disappear like they'd never existed. She should have been able to stop her. She should have been able to fight back. But she hadn't. She'd stood there, frozen, watching her followers vanish into nothing, and when Cora had finally looked at her, really looked at her, she'd seen something that terrified her even more than the power. She'd seen pity. You can go, Cora had said. Get out of here. And if I ever see you again, I won't be so merciful. Lily had run. She'd run until her lungs burned and her legs gave out, and then she'd kept going. She'd run because she didn't know what else to do. But now, sitting in the darkness of the gas station, she finally stopped. She thought about everything she'd done. The lies, the manipulation, the cruelty. She thought about Cora, the only person who'd ever tried to save her, the only person who'd ever believed she could be better. And she knew, with a clarity that cut through her like a blade, that she had wasted everything. The weeks that followed were the hardest of her life. She had no supplies, no followers, no power. She was just another survivor, scrabbling for scraps in a world that had no mercy for the weak. She learned to hunt, to scavenge, to fight. She learned to sleep with one eye open and never trust anyone. She learned to survive. But she didn't learn to let go. She thought about Cora constantly. About the life they'd shared, the sisterhood they'd destroyed, the future she'd thrown away. She thought about the space power, the one she'd always believed was hers, and how it had slipped through her fingers because she was too arrogant to believe anyone could be smarter than her. She thought about the moment Cora had let her go. Why? She whispered to the empty air. Why didn't you just kill me? She never got an answer. But she knew, deep down, that it was because Cora was better than her. Cora had always been better than her. And that was what made it hurt the most. The winter passed. The flood came. The world started to rebuild. And slowly, almost without realizing it, Lily started to change. She found a small community, a group of survivors who were trying to build something new. They didn't know who she was, what she'd done, or who she'd been before. They just saw a woman who was willing to work, to contribute, to be part of something bigger than herself. She didn't tell them about her past. She didn't tell them about Cora, or the stones, or the power she'd lost. She just worked, day after day, trying to earn the trust she'd never deserved. It wasn't easy. There were days when the old rage came back, when she wanted to scream and fight and take what she thought was hers. But she pushed it down. She reminded herself of the girl who'd stood in the gas station and realized she had nothing left to lose. She reminded herself that she could be better. The first time she saw Cora again was at a market. Lily was trading supplies, a few cans of soup for some medicine, when she looked up and saw her. Cora was standing a few stalls away, talking to a merchant, her face relaxed and happy. For a moment, Lily froze. Her first instinct was to run, to hide, to disappear before Cora noticed her. But then she stopped. She'd spent so long running. She'd spent so long hiding from the truth. Maybe it was time to face it. She walked toward Cora, her heart pounding in her chest. Cora looked up as she approached. For a moment, there was a flicker of something in her eyes. Surprise, wariness, maybe even fear. But then it was gone, replaced by a calm, steady gaze. "Lily," she said. "Cora." They stood there for a long moment, the noise of the market swirling around them. "I'm not going to try to hurt you," Lily said. "I just wanted to say something." "Say it." Lily took a breath. "Thank you. For letting me go. For giving me a chance to try to be better." Cora didn't say anything. She just nodded. "I know I can't undo what I did," Lily continued. "I know I can't make up for everything I took from you. But I can try to be someone different. Someone you wouldn't be ashamed to have known." Cora studied her for a long moment. Then she said, "I never hated you, Lily. I was angry, and I was hurt, and I wanted you to pay for what you did. But I never hated you." Lily felt tears prick at her eyes. "I know. That's what made it worse." Cora smiled, a small, sad smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Take care of yourself, Lily. And try to be better. For yourself, not for me." She turned and walked away. Lily watched her disappear into the crowd, and she let herself cry. She was still crying when she walked back to her tent, still crying when she lay down on her cot, still crying when she finally fell asleep. But when she woke up the next morning, she felt lighter than she had in years. Lily never saw Cora again after that day. She heard rumors sometimes, that Cora had found a new community, that she was helping people, that she was building something important. Lily didn't try to find her. She didn't think she deserved to. But she remembered what Cora had said. "Try to be better. For yourself, not for me." And she did. End of Extra 1. Extra 2, The New World. The city was finally coming back to life. It had been 2 years since the thaw, and you could almost forget what had happened. The streets were clean, the buildings rebuilt, the power grid restored. People walked around with their phones in their hands, drinking coffee and complaining about traffic, as if the end of the world had never happened. But it had happened. And the people who'd lived through it would never forget. I was one of those people. I'd helped build this city, helped organize the survivors, helped create a new world from the ashes of the old. It wasn't the world I'd grown up in. That world was gone forever. But it was a world worth living in. My parents were gone now. My father had passed away the year after the flood, quietly in his sleep, his heart finally giving out after a lifetime of hard work. My mother had followed him a few months later, unable to live without him. I'd buried them side by side, in a small cemetery at the edge of town. I missed them every day. But I knew they were at peace. The house I'd built was at the top of a hill, overlooking the city. It wasn't big, but it was comfortable. It had a garden in the back, a porch in the front, and a view that stretched for miles. I spent my mornings there, drinking coffee and watching the sunrise. It was a quiet life, a simple life. But it was mine. I'd also built a business, a small trading company that helped connect the scattered communities of survivors. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was honest. And it kept me busy. I thought about Lily sometimes. I'd heard she'd moved south, found a community of her own, started a new life. I didn't know if she'd changed, didn't know if she'd ever really changed. But I hoped she had. I'd also heard she was doing well. She'd become a leader, a planner, someone people could count on. It was a strange twist of fate, that the girl who'd once tried to destroy everything had ended up helping to rebuild it. Maybe that was the lesson. Maybe everyone deserved a second chance. The day I heard she'd died, I was in the garden, pulling weeds. It was a beautiful day, warm and sunny, the kind of day that made you forget the cold had ever existed. I was humming to myself, lost in my own thoughts, when one of my neighbors walked up the hill. "Cora," she said. "I have some news. It's about Lily." I stopped. "What about her?" "She passed away last night. Peacefully, in her sleep. They said she was smiling." I sat back on my heels and stared at the sky. I didn't feel sad, exactly. I didn't feel anything at all. "Thanks," I said, "for letting me know." My neighbor nodded and walked back down the hill. I stayed in the garden for a long time after she left, thinking about everything that had happened. The stones, the freeze, the flood. The second chance I'd been given, and the choices I'd made. I didn't regret any of it. Not the anger, not the fear, not the pain. Because all of it had led me here, to this moment, to this life. Lily was gone. And I was still here. I stood up and went back to work.